Welcome to Take the Cake. My name is April Gertler, and I'm your host. I developed Take the Cake in 2014 as a performative lecture that uses the form of a baking show. While baking a cake live, I lecture about the cake's history and the background of specific ingredients used in the cake, using a feminist and post-colonial lens. But let me just note here that I'm really flexible with the term cake. For me, cake is sort of a catch-all word, can also mean pie, loaf cake, or even cookies. At the end of all of the performances, I serve slices or pieces of the baked cake to the audience members so they can taste the cake for themselves, and the discussion can continue amongst the audience members. This edition of Take the Cake was commissioned by PhotoIreland for their cooking channel, premiering for this year's festival. They had initially invited me to create a new episode of Take the Cake to focus on the quintessential Irish cake and perform live in Dublin in July 2021. But due to the pandemic, I wasn't able to travel to Ireland to conduct my research. As a result, we agreed upon a podcast format. The invitation from PhotoIreland comes on the heels of a similar project I did in Amsterdam in the winter of 2019 during an artist residency I had there, where I did research on the Dutch national cake. At the time, I was exploring how a national cake could possibly give some insight into a cultural understanding of Dutchness, as I was on the precipice of becoming Dutch myself through my Dutch mother. In the end, it was rather straightforward in Amsterdam. I conducted just over 40 interviews in a 2-month period, and most everyone seemed to agree that apple tart was the go-to cake for the Netherlands. Out of that research, I developed Take the Cake Apple Tart and also put together an artist book of recipes written by hand that I collected from those I interviewed. PhotoIreland approached me to create a performance and a book like I did in the Netherlands for their festival, but since I wasn't able to travel to Ireland and meet people in person, I've been relegated to contacting Irish folks I know or know of via friends. Take the Cake is a project that usually transcends cake. The notion of cake inspires memory, generosity, comfort, family, home, and also very often deeper discussions around the difficult histories that include colonialism in an effort to question where we find ourselves within that history. I had the good fortune of spending time in Cork in 2011. During my stay at an artist residency at the guest house. There, I met some fantastic people, including the talented visual artist Pádraig Spillane. Before I contacted Pádraig, I didn't think this was going to be so difficult to find the answer to the question, what cake defines Ireland? To be honest, finding a cake to focus each previous edition of Take the Cake has always been one of the easier and also very fun parts of the project. But as I embarked on the Irish edition, it became very clear that everyone I spoke to had a very different idea of what defines the quintessential Irish cake. When I did the project in Amsterdam, it was fairly straightforward. But in retrospect, I have no idea why I thought I could compare that experience with what I was about to embark on here, remotely, in Ireland. There were a few main factors at hand. As I mentioned earlier, the biggest factor being that I wasn't able to travel to Ireland and meet people in person. But due to my inability to travel, I conducted all my interviews online, and in a sense I actually possibly traveled more virtually than I could have physically, resulting in having a chance to interview historians, chefs, and artists who are living throughout Ireland. Assessing the diversity of opinions in the interviews that I conducted, I can honestly say it could be that the regional differences of people's residence have possibly played an important role in the disparity of difference when asked which cake defines Ireland. As I attempted to keep a tally of cakes suggested, it became immediately evident that everyone I spoke to had a different idea of which cake should take the helm as the most Irish of cakes. Because each of the interviews I did resulted in such a wide-ranging set of responses, I've decided to focus this podcast, and the next one as well, on attempting to find an answer to this question: what cake defines Ireland? I'm thrilled to present Take the Cake, the Irish edition, to you now, and share this conversation I had with Pádraig.
Traditionally, Irish desserts would not have been very pleasing to the eye in relation to colour because we wouldn't have had the range of ingredients. A lot of things would have been traditionally brown. like portrait cake would be a dark brown or different variations of brown depending on the mixture. And then, apple tart, which is a big thing. Like my dad, would be the cake that he would have when he was out, would be brown with a little bit of kind of golden yellow perhaps in it, but, same hues perhaps, or a similar spectrum anyway, or whatever. So yeah, I think a lot of those things would have been based on taste, but not so much the visual pleasures, because fruit and different food colorings wouldn't have been available historically from, the 18th century on. So I think, in relation to Irish food culture, as much as in maybe other countries in relation to geographic things and different climates, most desserts were brown. And then in relation to commercial things in the past maybe 50 years, there's been changes and shifts in relation to what we eat as for dessert.
That actually confirms my thought, because I did a lot of visual image searches of cakes, and I was distressed to see the color range being so limited, as you mentioned, and also the forms. They're much more oriented towards the loaf cake form as opposed to a round cake. Isn't there a cake called the Barnbeck cake?
Oh yeah, Barnbrack.
Barnbrack. That's very loafy in style. I mean, I've seen it round, but it seems like it's more traditionally a loaf cake. And it really is strange for me to see it, because it looks like a bread as opposed to a cake. But I'm curious about this loaf cake delineation.
It is. I'm kind of assuming something here just through my ignorance, but maybe fruit breads are more common in Europe. In Ireland, fruit breads are not very common. So therefore, desserts with our kind of loafy and fruity would be all seen as desserts, even if they were called a loaf or something like that in their description. They would definitely be seen as a dessert. So the breads that we would have in Ireland, obviously they've been taken over by now by the sliced pan variety that are omnipresent in different stores, very much so. There's been more artisan bakeries pop up in Ireland. So when it comes to the differences, say, between breads and desserts that could be classed as fruit breads, that would probably be the thing. There's a certain thing about a stableness in relation to desserts, that you kind of know exactly what is going to be on the dessert list, in the sense of the apple tart will always be there. And I'm sure that's the same in the Netherlands. I think Barnbrack might be on the shelves more now, but Barnbrack would have been had around Halloween time. So that's my memory of it, that there would be like a ring in it, so you would have it, and that kind of thing. And I'm sure that's common in lots of different cultures, but there's lots of different things about a surprise within the cake, whether it could be it's always good, it's always a ring, I'm sure. And then that went from like a metal ring to a plastic ring, and I don't think for health and safety reasons you can have it anymore within the cake. You have to put it in yourself. But in relation to that, lots of raisins, lots of things like that. And I suppose the kind of maybe the spectrum then is like bread to something that's like a fruit bread to like a fruit cake, which is very, very heavy then, dense, lots of raisins, and then alcohol in it as well. So like, in relation to the tradition of Christmas pudding, another ritualistic cake dessert, and Christmas cake itself, they would be made traditionally, apparently, around October time with the drink, and then the drink being put into it maybe weekly. So then at Christmas time, it would be this almost, very opulent cake. So the cake would drink over that time. Also, just a thing, I was thinking about accompaniments for desserts. Apple pie and cream is almost traditional, but with Barnbrack, it would be butter. You'd butter it almost like bread. That's how my mum would have it. You definitely wouldn't have Barnbrack with cream. You'd have it with something slightly maybe salted. Nearly all Irish butter is salted.
Going back to a cake that defines Ireland, are you able to say which cake that might be? I mean, you did say porter cake.
I think porter cake is something that has maybe re-emerged, perhaps, but it has. There has been various different cakes that you would see on different, say, artisan restaurants or shops, like a Guinness cake. Then it would be flavoured with the stout of that area. So in Cork, it would be Murphy's or Beamish, and in Dublin, it would be Guinness. And because because Ireland is so small, it'd probably be Guinness cake is probably the one that's the most used in relation to porter. And then there's different variations of that. It can just be a big black cake, or else it can be kind of almost like carrot cake with a kind of a cream cheese frosting on top. So that kind of adds a different colour, and obviously then kind of mimics what porter would look like with the head on top. So like the porter cake then would mimic that. So it'd be this dark quite dense cake with then like a kind of a cream cheese frosting on top. So when you'd cut it, it would almost mimic what it would be in the glass with the white head on top. Carrot cake is so generic, I think, you know, in the world now, but carrot cake are all you always remember being around. But something that's not so much a cake, which I always remember from my childhood, is trifle. Trifle has always kind of existed there because I think it's oh my God, it can be anything. You know, you could it's a can of fruit, it's some jelly, a bit of custard from a packet, probably usually, and then some cream. So that is something, but I wouldn't call it distinctly Irish, but it is omnipresent in my memory. You know, going as a kid to, you know, kind of like holiday hotels, there'd be like the dessert trolley, you know, and that ritual of the dessert trolley coming around, and the trifle would always be there. You know, as an eater, sometimes we don't know exactly what's in the cake.
At this point, Pádraig and I started talking about seaweed and its use in food, both historically and also contemporarily. In some preliminary research for this project, I came across some articles in addition to a chapter in the book, A Little History of Irish Food by Regina Sexton, about seaweed. I asked Pádraig whether or not seaweed was not only a part of his diet, but commonly incorporated into food in general.
But in the main kind of train of, say, plain eaters in relation to Ireland, I would say seaweed is not a knowingly big thing in our food culture.
Seaweed was really used right at the end of the Great Famine when people really just had no food and they were using it and realized, oh, this actually is very rich in vitamins and this is in fact really good for your body to eat seaweed. And so the Irish just sort of developed lots of foodstuffs around seaweed at this certain time in history. And I guess that did get lost.
It could get lost because of the exodus from Ireland because of the famine and then because of economic things in the 20th century. But also, you know, that thing of like, oh, that food comes from that point in time where we don't want to think about it anymore, so we don't use it anymore. So there can be that kind of thing of like a cultural, I don't know if the word is amnesia in relation to that, but a choice in relation to it, that amnesia. We don't want to be thinking about that anymore, so we're not going to cook with it anymore. You know, in relation to the history of Ireland as well, you know, one of the reasons that the potato famine happened was because it failed as a crop, but also because holdings got smaller and smaller through inheriting the land. So say if there was 8 sons, and they inherited a bit of whatever land that was there, then suddenly there was 8 farms, and you had to make sure that you had a crop that would yield something quite positively. So therefore, that's how it became dependent on potatoes. And then when that happened, so, you know, it kind of wiped out lots of food things that were coming through. So therefore, the reliance on the sea, I don't think was ever a factor. Do you know what I mean? At that time, because everyone was so concentrated on what they could get from the land. This is kind of really sad to think about it, that one crop and its failure for 2 years just allowed all of this to happen. But it was actually all the things that were happening on the land that went up to that point, that we had to become dependent on one crop because we needed a yield that would be big enough to feed a family, or to feed a family and be able to sell outwards. What you might make at home and what you might buy in for your home. I don't really make dessert. I would buy it in. I'd make a starter or a main course, but I wouldn't really make a dessert. Unless it's a ritual thing, whether it's a birthday or something else. I don't know, I was just going to say, I wasn't one of those people that suddenly got into banana bread this time last year. Banana bread. I wouldn't even eat banana bread before this.
What desserts would you buy if you go to the shop? And what shops do you go to? Do you go to a bakery or do you go to a high-end grocery store? Where do you go? What do you buy?
A lot of different places. I suppose I'd go to supermarkets and I would buy things there. I would go to, there's a little kind of French bakery place called Cameron on Washington Street. It's Ali's Kitchen, which is a place in Cork as well. You know, that kind of variation between going to very small selective artisan places and then going for the generics. Like yesterday I bought a Battenberg, one of those Battenbergs, a small one, probably the size of my hand, that's wrapped in plastic, that I cut, and I get that kind of taste of marzipan because that's what I wanted. I wanted a variation of taste. I didn't want something that I'd normally have. And I suppose that's why I'm allergic to the idea of banana bread. I'm like going, you want things that are different to what you can normally have. You know, so that's my psychology anyway. But I'm wary to say it, but I think a lot of people do that now. You know, you want something generic and then you want something really kind of interesting. So you go to the artisan place. I don't think everyone really goes to the artisan place. I don't think many Irish people could afford it, going to the arts and places all the time. The generic kind of mass-produced food as well, sometimes it can be very interesting just to taste and just kind of get used to certain flavors. It's almost like entry points into other things than that you further explore. It's actually a circle, or maybe it's parallels that you can jump between, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think there's a big interaction between those things, because you could taste something in one, and whether it's the artisan one, and then you come across it in the aisles of the supermarket, but through a different company or whatever, and then you kind of go, oh, that's really interesting, and then you might compare the two, this big mass-produced one, and then this one that's baked. Maybe there's only a small batch and it's made that day, and then you make your own decisions. I think that's one of those things about taste. It's a physical experience as well as, the social experience and all those kind of the political experiences. So we make our choices on that.
It's also an experience about memory.
Yes, very much so. Actually, one of the things that I just know that I mentioned this to you, they were a generic thing. They were a plastic pack. They're like almond fingers, but they're not fingers. They're the size of maybe 2 fingers. You know what I mean? And they'd be maybe the size of a mouse. It would be this kind of almond sponge with a kind of a dark kind of brown, kind of not so much a crust. It's just hard on the outside, and then there would be like one whole almond in the center, on top as a decoration, and there would have been 8 of them in a packet, and Dad would have just wolfed through them, no problem. And I think you can still get them. They're not as maybe popular anymore. When I saw it in the 80s and the early 90s, there was just this clear packet and these like little cakes just sitting there uniform, which I think is quite nice. I just think sometimes we like uniformity when we see things as well.
Yeah, symmetry. And it's calming, and it makes you feel somehow relaxed and at ease. It reminds me of the Madeleine, the size of the palm of your hand, and these cakes. This is the whole Marcel Proust, this idea of memory, and these little cakes just look exactly the same, and they're not intimidating. That's the other thing. I think sometimes I have that experience, like when I go into a French bakery, oftentimes the cakes are so overwhelming because they're so sort of grand. I get intimidated and I can't decide which one I want. It feels like they're all kind of too good to eat, and I don't know. I don't feel like I even know how to enter into that world, because it's just too much. So somehow breads or cakes or cookies are just, when it doesn't look like beautiful, it's sort of somehow easier. It's like,
completely.
There's it's more down to earth somehow. It's like there's a relaxed entry point, just visually speaking.
And those things, sometimes they're so pretty that there's going to be a surprise within it that maybe is going to jar slightly with your memories of certain foods or your ideas of what this should be, or maybe that one thing would overwhelm everything else that's within it. Like after dinner, you'd have it as a kind of an event in itself, like a little treat. You wouldn't have it at the end of a menu or at the end of a dinner and dessert kind of thing.
Okay, so let's go back to this question, because I'm still looking for the answer.
Yeah.
I think it's maybe barnbrack or porter cake.
No,
No.
I was thinking about this over the week, and I think the cake that most people would probably, a default one, is apple tart. Yeah, because we would have orchards historically. It would have been there. Apples would have been there. And then pastry would have been easy, in relation to eggs, butter. Actually, interestingly, just for your own knowledge, because of Brexit, the price of flour in Ireland has gone up because we don't really make flour in Ireland. So that's something that might be of interest. I don't know whether that's going to be fixed, but there was a big thing there a few months ago when the borders changed, that the price of loaves of bread would go up by like 5 cents.
Interesting about apples, because apples originate deep Russia. So that's the origins of apples. So apples were brought west through the Silk Road, through trade, through people just carrying them as they went. So they're not native to the UK or to Ireland at all. And they're not native at all to Western Europe, even though when I did the apple tart study in the Netherlands, people were completely convinced that the apple isn't actually a Dutch fruit, and it isn't. And nor is it a kind of a fruit that was found in the Americas. Not at all. Brought over from England. Thing about apples is that they grow very well in many different parts of the world. So they kind of adapt very easily. But yeah, they're not a native plant.
And it's weird that kind of the omnipresence of a fruit, just in culturally, you just think it's part of your own world. It's kind of an odd thing, isn't it?
Yeah, you totally think it's part of your world. I mean, in America, we have this saying is, nothing is as American as apple pie. But it's so far from actually being American in this way. Yeah, absolutely. And you think that these things are sort of normal or part of your inherent culture that dates far back, beyond you and beyond, in fact, what you even know, that this deep history, and you start realizing, it's not exactly how it seems.
It's interesting, the word orchard. I have a particular vision of kind of like lines of trees, and all that kind of thing, in rows. So I suppose they would, obviously they're cultivation, all that kind of thing, but where would they be within the Irish landscape? I'm thinking, are they behind the walls of estates historically, and now they're behind the walls of commercial enterprises? They're not like, you don't see them just on the road, in a normal field or something like that. They are protected in some sort of way, shape or form from people who might take apples. And I suppose then going back into kind of, films from maybe the 40s and the 50s, children breaking into orchards to take apples. So it's interesting that it's something that is within someone else's or something else's land and protected therefore from others. So It's interesting that it seems to be this kind of common cake, but actually its origins are probably within other power structures because of that. And as you said, it coming with other people as well. I'm assuming here, the apple, when you eat an apple and then you throw the core away, it's kind of interesting that it doesn't they're not everywhere. It doesn't need that care, but also it has that thing about power in relation to it as well.
I mean, this is the other thing about apples, that the seeds are not true to type, meaning that if you eat an apple and you love it and you think, oh, I want to grow this apple, this is amazing, and you save the seeds and you grow the seeds, it will produce a completely different apple. They're not going to produce the apple that you know. So that translates to apple varieties being, and this is why orchards, I guess, are so protected, is that apple varieties grow through grafting. So you have a tree that produces an apple and you decide that's the apple that you love. Well, you can't regrow that apple without taking limbs from that tree and grafting it onto a new tree. And that's how that apple will then duplicate. So that's why I guess commercial orchards are so protected, because all of the work and effort that goes into producing large crops of one sort of apple is quite extreme.
That's so mad, isn't it? It's just all that care and splitting something and then putting it.
Yeah, the way that you do it. It feels like such an extremely disturbing amputation of a tree. Like that whole process is so violent, actually. And then sort of wrapping it, with like gauze, like special gardening gauze to kind of heal the wound and make it kind of connect to another body, in fact.
Thomas Kinsella, an Irish poet, who I remember from my Leaving Cert because it was on the syllabus. There's a line in one of his poems that goes, hacked clean for better bearing, and he's talking about trees, and it's just that interesting thing, that visual of kind of like life then being taken down, or something that's grown, and then for it to grow bigger and stronger, but that violence in relation to that, as you said. I'm trying to think there now. Yeah, I would definitely go with apple tart. And I think if anyone kind of maybe thought about a traditional thing, that, it would be served with cream, different obviously from an American apple pie. But yeah, I would think that it would probably be in our now 2020s world, it's probably a little bit old school in relation to being a dessert. You probably wouldn't see it in many restaurants, or cool restaurants anymore, unless they've done something really elaborate to it. Definitely served with cream, definitely hot with cream.
When you say cream, what do you mean? Is the cream, because I know in England specifically, I don't know so much in Ireland, but in England specifically, when you say something comes with cream, the cream is not whipped. It's like liquid, thick cream. Is that what you mean? Or do you mean whipped?
It would be whipped. It would be whipped cream.
Okay.
Yeah, it would be icing sugar or some sugar on the top, I would think.
There are a gazillion ways to make apple pie or apple tart. So it's called apple tart, not apple pie.
Yeah, I would think so, yes.
Okay. And does it have a cover over it, or is it just open, or is it latticed on top?
It would never really be open. It would always have either a lattice structure on top or covered.
How high would it be approximately?
I would say maybe 2 to 3 centimeters. No, something like that. It would have a depth to it for definite. So it's definitely, the pastry is, I've never really thought about it like this, but it's encasing the apples, but it is its own thing as well, and no soggy bottoms and all that kind of thing. It would very much be trying to get away from that moment. So I can imagine different people in country shows maybe kind of like judging apple tarts that were coming from different places and kind of, thinking about those things. And actually, but it wouldn't be the same as it would be in the UK. In some ways, I'm kind of, not that I'm disappointed that is my answer, but it's not a hugely, visually it's not a very exciting cake. But I suppose as you said, there are so many different ways to access the cake and talk about it. Oh yeah, it would never really be flavored. It would just be with sugar and apple. Cinnamon sometimes is maybe too American, in the sense of that. I've as a waiter, I've had that question to me: is there cinnamon in it? And I've said no. So it's that thing where people can pick up certain things. They want the purity, perhaps, of the apple and the sugar. The recipe there for the Cullihill apple pie: caster sugar, flour, sugar, apples, egg wash. There's nothing else in it. That would be what I would.
Cloves.
Cloves are fine.
That's interesting that there would be cloves. So it's a very autumnal dessert.
Yes, actually. Yeah.
During harvest of apples, obviously.
Yes. The move then, because of commercial food movement, I wonder historically, would the apple tart only have been in the autumn? How do apples get stored for long periods of time? And would the apple tart have only been around that period? Well, now we can have it whenever we want.
I really enjoyed the conversation with Pádraig and his comprehensive overview of some key Irish cakes out there. After speaking about barmbrack, porter and Guinness cake, carrot cake, trifle, in addition to those small almond cakes his father adored, Pádraig settled on apple tart as being the most Irish of cakes in his opinion. Even though he admitted that he was possibly even a little disappointed in his own choice, he seemed to think it made sense, considering its longevity and availability in Irish cuisine. I was also a bit surprised that he would choose the apple tart, especially having spent 3 months thinking, eating, and discussing the Dutch apple tart in the Netherlands. But apples and their relationship to Ireland go way back, like at least 3,000 years back. Apple trees, including crabapple trees, orchards, and apples have featured prominently in many ancient Irish manuscripts and texts from the earliest times right up to the early modern period, confirming the widespread cultivation and use of apples throughout Irish history. As a side note, some of the 70 identified apple varieties in Ireland have quite unusual names, such as Maiden's Blush, Bloody Butcher, and even April Queen, a name, of course, I quite like. It's documented that apples have been used for cider making, baking, and simply eating since as far back as 2,000 years. Apples do play a very significant role in Irish culture. Going back to the comment that Pádraig made about foods being stable choices on a menu, and apple tart being just that item, it makes sense this would be his choice. Although Pádraig did make a good argument for the apple tart, I can honestly say his opinion is but one of many diverse opinions out there when trying to pinpoint the most Irish of cakes. In the next episode of Take the Cake, I'll share conversations I had with the food historian Regina Sexton and the artist Mark Curran and hear what their choices are for the most Irish of cakes. But maybe, more importantly, there will be a continued discussion which started here with Pádraig about the incredible impact the Great Famine had on Ireland and its food culture. It is clearly impossible to talk about cake and food without digging deeper into that history. I hope you can join me for the next episode of Take the Cake. I wanted to thank Julia Gelisova from PhotoIreland and Pádraig Spillane for their support and time in helping me put this podcast together.